I'm pleased to be able to share some thoughts with you this afternoon on Andy Warhol. For those of you who may not have attended it, there is an excellent exhibition going on right now at the Whitney Museum of Art, which will continue to the end of March on Andy Warhol's art, and I highly recommend it. It's the most complete exhibition ever done, and there hasn't been a complete one on this level in over 20 years, so it's something I can highly recommend at the Whitney. In any event, Andy Warhol's life, born in 1929 and died in 1987. He was born Andrew Warhola, a Slovakian family, and he changed his name not because he was trying to disengage himself from his cultural background, but because everything, when he came to New York as a commercial artist, everything that was published about him, repeatedly they left the A off. And finally, he got a break with a rather major article in the New York Times for his commercial design, and they left the A off, which was really a major editing mistake, and so at that point he simply dropped the A, and he became known as Andy Warhol. Born in Pittsburgh, of a religious family of the Ruthenian Byzantine Church, with union with Rome, he attended the Carnegie Institute of Technology, where his professors remember him as, first of all, very inventive, a genius in terms of ideas and creative ideas, but also having a superb hand for draftsmanship and line, which led to his career as a commercial designer when he came to New York. So he came to New York in the late 1940s and entered commercial design, mainly doing designs for sale of shoes, but sometimes even creating very avant-garde models, and sometimes they would be adapted for shoes that were actually made. And he established a very good career for himself, a good reputation as a commercial designer, and we see some of the examples of them. And as I say, some of them were so good that designers would actually take his suggestions and see if they could incorporate them. He also did a number of store windows in major department stores, particularly for the department store Bonwit Teller. Bonwit Teller was an exclusive women's department store just a few doors down from St. Patrick's Cathedral. The building is long since gone. And this is an example in the late 40s of the store windows that he did. And so he had a reasonably good reputation. I will just say that if you look at these, they were very avant-garde. And if you look at what he has, these are not typical store windows. You see several things. In the comic images, comic strip images, you actually see a prefiguration of what would become pop art. Even though it wasn't Warhol who continued the use of the comic image in pop art, but rather Roy Lichtenstein. But the other thing is, and we don't have time to do that, if you went through the images, there's a gentle critique of the whole commercial enterprise. There's a sort of a gentle mocking of the very products that are being sold. Bonwit Teller understood it, and they thought it was just wonderful, as did the public. But I will come back to that, to this idea of a critique of the commercial world of which he was totally a part. He also designed for a number of years Christmas cards for major department stores, and particularly for Tiffany's, and we see here some of his designs. Well, there's the man himself. And so we come to 1962, the Campbell soup cans. So after establishing this reputation, then he began to paint. And he began not only to paint, which he had been doing, but to offer these for exhibition in galleries. More avant-garde galleries would be willing to accept them and put them around. He used to have ice cream regularly at Serendipity. And some of his first art that was exhibited for sale were on the walls of an ice cream shop, a high-end ice cream shop, but basically that. And he began to be noticed. So this is one of his Campbell soup cans of 1962, acrylic paint on canvas. So ordinary. Every kitchen closet in those days had at least one can of Campbell soup. Not a very good soup in those days, it was way too salty, but everybody kept it in for a rainy day. Really, a truly American product, Campbell soup. But suddenly, not in your cabinet, but on the wall of a gallery or one day of a museum in gigantic proportions in acrylic paint. A can of soup, Campbell's soup. So what are we supposed to make of it? It was really shocking to the art world. They had never seen anything like this. And I want to give you a summary of the stages that art reception, the critical world, went through in dealing with Warhol. First, they ignored him, totally. Nothing was written about as he did his Campbell soup cans, his Brillo boxes, and the Coca-Cola. And they began to be exhibited more and more, and were beginning to be purchased by serious collectors, and rarely acquired by a museum. When they could no longer ignore him, they derided him. They laughed at this art, the critics. This is a man with no imagination. How little imagination could you have as to paint a can of soup? The project is ridiculous. Coca-Cola bottles. This is somebody who's bankrupt in terms of ideas. When they could no longer deride him because increasingly he was imposing himself upon the public art world, then they turned to attack. This is bad art, and I will come back to why this was attacked viciously. And then finally, when the number of collectors and galleries who people acquired the art, he could no longer be ignored because he was an international figure. These same critics then worshipped at his feet. And of course, the last stage was the worst of all because it was the most dishonest. They were not going to be left off the bandwagon. And I'll be coming back to this, the issue of the reception of the art world. This was an artist who, from the beginning, even though he ended up being the ultimate figure of the art world of his time, was really at the fringes on the outside. He had gone too far. It was okay for Andy Warhol to be a successful American commercial designer, but to think that you're going to create paintings, acrylic paintings and silk screens, and have them exhibited in galleries and bought by important collectors, no, you've gone a little bit too far. But the fact is that he was giving a new look at very ordinary and familiar objects. And in addition, in taking your can of Campbell's soup from the closet and painting on it an enormous canvas that could be seen on the walls of an apartment or a gallery or a museum, he was manipulating it, because now it was a painted can of soup. He was manipulating the image. It was out of its place. What do you make of it? Now, there's definitely in all of this a commercial aspect, because Warhol was a commercial designer par excellence. And in addition, from the beginning, he had an incredibly commercial sense of how to manipulate his career. And one of the things he was criticized for, an artist is supposed to be poor, starving, and living in a garret, and he had the ability to promote himself phenomenally. So he brought the commercial sense to it. Even more, I think, relevant are the Coca-Cola bottles. My favorite is this one from 1962, green Coca-Cola bottles. Everything I just said about the soup cans could be said about the Coca-Cola bottles. It is the perfect American object. I like Coke. I don't like much soda, but I like Coke because I'm going to say some things about it, and I just like regular Coke. And his genius in choosing this one, America, this is America, 1962, America, 1968. When I began teaching art in 1968, as the course I would do a survey, I would end by saying, class, you're looking at America today, and most people don't like what they see. And when we look in the mirror and we don't like what we see, we either have to walk away from it or break the mirror. And the image was somewhat painful, so it was easier to attack it or to deride it. Why do I say that? If the world goes on for another 100,000 years and they eventually excavate under what was once America, they're going to find more of these things in the ground than any other product you can think of. And if they've lost track with who they are, we're going to wonder, did they worship it? What was it? It's the ultimate American product. When China was opened under Nixon to trade and so forth, the first company they got a foothold in, and they wanted it, was a Coca-Cola bottling company. It's the ultimate American product. Every American's military secret has been stolen by someone, but no one's ever gotten the formula for Coca-Cola. And he understood this. And he puts it before us and stacks it up the way we live in apartments, right? Or mass-produced on it. And he says, America, here we are. And it's painful. Mass-produced, this is it. Commercial to a fault. There is a certain genius in this. And this is the artist who, getting in ordinary things, I love ordinary things. He was asked, why do you paint Coca-Cola bottles? Why do you paint soup? It's just that I like ordinary things. And we're looking at it. And I felt it, not because I was some sort of genius, but from the first time I began to see it, look at it maybe in 1966 and following, I understood it. I understood what it was about. And not because I'm a genius, but because if you didn't bring baggage against him, it was so clear what he was doing. And yet there is a gentle critique of this commercial culture from someone inside it. And the reason it's gentle, and he has the right to do it, is he was a shopaholic par excellence. He was a commercial artist. He turned this kind of art into commercial success. So he was trapped in this culture and was, in a sense, almost had a right to critique it, not from a moral superiority, but from an experience of it. Okay. The only time I met Andy Warhol, he was involved with ordinary things. There was in the 70s and 80s, somewhere in Chelsea, a gigantic flea market that used to be on the weekends on some big vacant lot where they were waiting eventually to put up a skyscraper. And I'd always heard about it. And I like flea markets because I collect old photos. And in those days, you could get a beautiful carte de visite or a cabinet card, museum quality for $2 or $3. So if I saw those junky flea markets, I would look. And one day I was cutting from a luncheon down through the 20s to get to the F train. And I came upon the flea market I had always heard about, called the Chelsea Market, not the one we have today. And I went in there, hundreds and hundreds of tables with junk on it, okay? And people milling around, and I'm looking at this long table like this, people on both sides looking at junk, and next thing I look next to me, and Andy Warhol is standing there, right next to me, looking at the same junk that I am. And I remember thinking, oh, that's right, he collects junk. He loves to go to the flea markets, and particularly cookie jars. He used to collect those big 50s cookie jars, the bizarre things that would be like a clown, and you would take the head off, or a bunch of bananas, and you would take the top off. It said after he died there were shopping bags in his closets filled with them that had never been unwrapped. So I knew right away, oh, and there he was. Now I did what every New Yorker would do. I ignored him totally. Because we New Yorkers, we let our public figures go out and have a day out for themselves. I wasn't about to say, oh, Mr. Warhol, whatever. And you know something, so did everybody else, because there were people on the other side of the table facing him, and nobody paid him the least bit of attention because we were all New Yorkers. But what a quintessential moment to see him, because he loved ordinary things, and this is what he understood. Now, the attacks. Why was this attack? Well, it was attacked because from the art point of view, he had reintroduced the image into painting. In a world in which abstract painting had run dominant, I love abstract painting, and the image really was only for third-class artists in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, he had reintroduced images. The shock of seeing a can of Campbell's soup painted to perfection, or Coca-Cola bottles, forget the commercial aspect. It was a challenge to the art establishment that had been dominant for 40 years. And they went after him tooth and nail because they rightly understood if this art began to be accepted, then the image would return and their little tyranny of abstract and non-objective art would be over. And indeed, they were right to, because he was one of two who changed. If we're used to seeing today not only beautiful abstract paintings, but paintings with images, Andy Warhol is one of two people responsible for that in these early paintings. They were absolutely right. So what I wanted to show you just very briefly is the art that dominated before the Coke bottles and the soup cans. Helen Frankenthaler, and this is beautiful art. Helen Frankenthaler's paintings, Jackson Pollock's extraordinary paintings, none of them with images. And most of all, Barnett Newman's Vera Heroicus Sublimis, the color field paintings, where basically you have one color. This was the dominant art, and the beautiful art, but it was a tyranny. When you went to art school in these days, they wouldn't teach you drawing. If you wanted to design and so forth, you were in trouble. And he broke into that world with images. And that was one of the reasons he was so viciously attacked. And he's one of two people who brought that about. But he didn't just paint objects, he painted people, such as the famous paintings of Marilyn Monroe, of which we see just one here. Ordinary people, they might say, she's not an ordinary person. Mao Zedong and Richard Nixon and all sorts of people, and Jackie Kennedy. But they were ordinary people because we saw them all every day in photographs in the media and on TV and in film. And he takes someone ordinary and presents us to us in a new format and asks, have you ever really looked? Now for these he uses silkscreen, and I'm not going to go into detail, but he brings, silkscreen was an ancient and very old technique, centuries old, which he brought to a high level. In the silkscreen, what you do is you can project the image onto the support, whether it's a canvas, linen, or a composite board. But then of the silkscreen, you filter in inks, and for each of the colors you see, you have a different stencil. And you block everything out except the yellow hair. Then you put another stencil and you block everything out except the lips, and you keep adding the colors. It's a very work-intensive process that enables a kind of coloring in the images that you don't get usually with engravings and other color reproductions. Very complex. By the way, silkscreen used to be used, now it's either nylon or synthetic fabric. Very, very complicated. We can say without question that silkscreen was brought to a level of perfection under the direction of Andy Warhol that it had never had before. And so we have images like this of Marilyn Monroe, a new look at a familiar image. Okay? Now, the question is also, he has reworked it, because in the multiple images of Marilyn Monroe, each one is a little bit different. And so the same question is asked, have we ever really looked at Marilyn Monroe at all? What are we to make of this image? Now what he's doing in manipulating the colors like this is he's doing something that Marcel Duchamp had done in the 1920s, the French-American New York painter, who purchased a very good quality poster of the Mona Lisa and painted a mustache on her and put initials on the bottom and framed her and brought it to a gallery. The manipulation of an iconic image, here in this case, taking it from a photo, but reworking the colors. And what we're going to see is in all of this, he's also engaging the history of Western art since the late 1870s. What happens if we take an image we've always seen and we manipulate it slightly? That's what Marcel Duchamp did with the Mona Lisa way back. What happens if we rework an iconic image? Did we ever really look at Marilyn Monroe before? Have we ever really looked at our Campbell's soup? Do you ever look really at a bottle of Coca-Cola? And so what he does is, in a dream world of walking around sort of in a sleepwalking, he shocks us into a new way of looking at ordinary things and in daily reality. Not the shock of the new so much as the shock of the ordinary. But then there's also this, the multiple series of images. And you see each one is different, somewhat different or a little bit different. And in doing these, including the Coca-Cola bottles, each of which was a little different, he engages something else, which we call the question of seriality. And by that, what happens if you take not one Marilyn Monroe, but 9? Or, as in one of his later paintings, 60 Last Suppers on a wall? Do you cheapen the image by multiplying it? What do you make of that? And this is what we call seriality. But what he's re-engaging is something that emerged in the late 19th century as a question and then disappeared. First of all, Monet. We all know Monet and those beautiful paintings of the Rouen Cathedral, of which he did 32 versions of the same facade. 32 versions, oil paintings. And he did so because, as you know in his art, he was doing a different light on it every 5 to 10 minutes. So you're not painting the cathedral, you're painting the light, and you could easily paint 32 times. But some critics in the late 1800s began to say, we're not comfortable with 32 versions of a painting. Doesn't that cheapen it? Doesn't it? They began to raise the question, and then it died away. Or Rodin, who did, of course, his famous Thinker, but then did about 18 other copies in stone, wood, plaster, marble, large, small, for indoors, for outdoors. A sculptor had never made so many copies of his own masterpiece. And critics were raising the question, is this seemly? Is this something an artist should do, to have multiple copies? The question of seriality. And then it sort of died away. And Warhol re-engages all of this. So one of the things about the art of Andy Warhol is, I think some of these are very beautiful. I think the soup cans are beautiful. But more than an art of beauty, it's an art of ideas. He's constantly engaging the history of Western art, at least from 1874. And this is what has to be understood when one approaches his art, which was so often reduced to cheap commercialism from a man who had no imagination. Could not have been further from the truth. I would recommend, by the way, if this issue of the original and its copy, whether you're dealing with the mustache added to the Mona Lisa or these, the critic Rosalind Krauss, who devoted her critical life to this issue of the original and its copy. A scholar whose work I would recommend to you, Rosalind Krauss. He engages all of that. Now, let me just summarize. He returns the image to painting, which was one of the major contributions to art that we have today, and it infuriated the entire art establishment. He raises the issue of an iconic image, something we know, manipulated, as Marcel Duchamp had done. He deals with seriality, Monet and Rodin, and the whole idea of the original and its multiple. Now, I do want to mention, before I move on to the next section, that there was one other artist who also helped to reintroduce the image into American art, and that's Jasper Johns, who studied at the Parsons School of Design. You may know his American flag painting, so that's just an example. It would be unfair not to mention him, because with Warhol, these two figures stood against the tyranny of abstract painting. And I love abstract painting, but there's place for the image as well. And the thing about his paintings of flags is they're objects also, so that one critic standing in front of Jasper Johns' painting of the flag said, I don't know if I should just appreciate it or salute it. He got the point. The image and the object is returning. Also, Andy Warhol is credited for being the founder of pop art. Art from the popular culture, from the art of the people. Well, absolutely, soup cans and Coca-Cola, it doesn't get too much more popular than that. Or Mao Zedong and all of the movie stars and so forth. But I would say of all of it, to me, that interests me the least. Yes, that's fine, great. But when you focus on that, you're missing the real contributions that this man made to American art. And you have other people like Klaus Oldenburg and Roy Lichtenstein and so forth who did other things. I'm watching my time and I'm delighted because the second half, I'm right where I want to be, is I wanted to give that as background to discuss with you today the religious art of Andy Warhol. And we could not really have done that without seeing the larger work. This photo, when Andy Warhol went in February of 1987 for a gallbladder operation and died overnight, should not have, in one of the city's best hospitals, totally unexpected. And so when his funeral took place, at the funeral, they exhibited this photo that someone took the next day in his studio. And there were these enormous religious paintings that almost nobody knew anything about. The critic, Jane Dillenberger, who was both an art historian and a theologian in California, said, I'm going to learn more about these. And she started to go around trying to find out how many religious paintings there are. And she found almost nothing. Well, it turned out there were almost 270 religious paintings, but she had the hardest time finding it. They were either owned privately or in galleries not being exhibited and so forth. The whole issue of how he could have painted 112 paintings of the Last Supper and over 200 paintings of Christ in the last 2 years of his life, and when this photo appeared at his funeral, nobody knew anything about them. Very, very interesting. So today, it's true that many people who understand a little bit, not a little bit, but a lot about Andy Warhol and like his art are surprised to hear that he has an enormous body of religious painting. As I mentioned, they were Slovakian heritage, Ruthenian Catholics, and when they couldn't worship because the church is in union with Rome, they would worship in the Catholic Church, and he was very comfortable with that. It's an autonomous church in full union with Rome. There we see him So there was this other side of the life of Andy Warhol. We know Andy Warhol of the factory, Andy Warhol of all of that culture, but there was the practicing, religious, believing Andy Warhol. He went to daily mass almost every day, certainly 3 times a week at the very minimum, as well as Sunday mass, and he wore a cross, carried a rosary, and served often at the soup kitchen of the Church of the Heavenly Rest in Manhattan, where you can check the photos of him. The people absolutely adored him, the way he took care of the homeless people who came, waited on them, sat with them, talked with them, financed his nephew's studies to the priesthood, but none of this was ever reported or discussed, ever, ever, ever. He went to St. Vincent Ferrer to Mass 3 times a week, and nobody said anything about it. The parishioners out of respect for his privacy, and the priest out of respect. But after he died and the word came out, everybody admitted, oh yes, he was there all the time. In 1987, he created over 100 paintings based on the Last Supper. And I'm just going to show you a little bit of his religious art, but I want to point something out. So there's this other side to Andy Warhol, the believer, the practitioner of the faith, and therefore this art. I'm going to begin with Santa Apollonia, but we have images going back to 1957, sketches. I wasn't able to get an image online, of his own hand holding a beautiful, small carved German crèche. His religious art goes way back to his teen years, and certainly to his years at the Carnegie Institute of Technology. And so, for example, in the 1984, he does a whole series, seriograph on paper, of saints of the Catholic Church, including Saint Apollonia. And he's basing himself, of course, on Piero della Francesca. And what he's doing in many of these is taking a saint and adapting it from a great Renaissance masterpiece, but with great respect. And if you know the style of Piero, this kind of rigid standing. But she's holding her tooth because that's the mark of Saint Apollonia, who was tortured by having her teeth removed. And these images are religious and devout, and the coloration is that of the icon in the back. And he's working off earlier art in the Renaissance, but creating works that are respectful and could be exhibited in a church and prayed in front of. There's this whole dimension of that. There are the cross paintings of 1980 that they seem to float and therefore look a little blurred, but they're not. It's not that the image is badly received. I love the yellow one. And while they float forward, you see this incredible shadowing on the right side, don't you? And there's a whole series of these. Again, the seriality appears. Now, these works were exhibited throughout Europe, but particularly in Italy, and utterly unreported in the United States. No news carried the news of it, and so forth. So, for example, his large yellow Last Suppers, exhibited in a palazzo directly across the street from the original Last Supper in Milan. All right? And the one that I want to look at, because we could be lost in the number of images, I want to look at my favorite, and you can pursue this on your own. And I do want to leave time for questions and your own issues that you may want to raise. But I want to look at a 1986 Last Supper, synthetic polymer on canvas, which is my favorite. Now, the first reaction when some see this is, what a sacrilege. You take a reproduction in the sense of the Last Supper, and you put these cheap commercial things across it and deface it. And nothing could be further from the truth. So within the limits of time, I want to explain what he's done. First of all, he's taken the Last Supper, which was way up elevated, if you've ever gone and seen it, and brought it down to our level. So for the first time, you look at the Last Supper at its own level, which was impossible with the way Leonardo created it. Second, the figures are larger than they even were in the Milan painting, in the refectory. Third, he eliminates much that's distracting of the walls and so forth. And by the way, he abandons silkscreen and begins to paint these by hand, on canvas and on linen, himself returning to the painted image. And suddenly we have Christ in front of us. Next, what source does he use for the image? He uses an 1800s published encyclopedia of artists and painters and paintings, which was in 1800 one of the major sources for critics who wrote about works of art. Many scholars who wrote about the Last Supper never saw the Last Supper. They used this encyclopedia. And he takes this image in which countless essays were written for over a century based on the image in that book, the engraving in that book, in which the artist took great liberties, left details out, and changed things. And that's the one he uses. And since we won't look at the ones that are done with silkscreen, for those, he uses an 1885 image that Goethe used to write about the Last Supper without ever having seen it. But he raises another question. Who has ever seen the Last Supper? The Last Supper had deteriorated within 50 years to such a degree that really no one after the first 50 years has ever seen the Last Supper. And then there were the repaintings. And the fact that scholars, by and large, didn't go to see it and work from other texts. Do you see how he's engaging the history of art even as he begins this religious painting? The point I want to make is this is not sentimental Andy being religious near the end of his life, but rather he's engaging the whole history of Western art and how we've looked at this masterpiece. Have we ever looked at it? This is probably the text that you've had when you've looked at some other reproduction. But he brings it down to level, and then he puts these things on it. Now, 59 cents. In the time in which he did it, that was the sale price. If you could get something for 59 cents, it doesn't come cheaper than that. So there it is, cheap commercialism. He was fascinated and collected cheap, vulgar reproductions of the Last Supper. He would go into these stores in Times Square and buy them. He was always fascinated with the popular image of an image. So 59 cents. And then Dove soap. What's more American than Dove soap? Right in front of Christ. And GE. GE, our refrigerators, our air conditioners, and our light bulbs. Sacrilegious. No, not at all. Because what he's saying is, as we come to the religious experience of the divine, these are the filters. This is what mediates between us and our vision of the spiritual. And it's crass and it's commercial, and he's part of it, and so are we. And I want to point something out. He's fascinated with consumerism 20 years before it was fashionable to write about it. Today, of course, everyone writes about the consumer culture. No one was writing about it when he did these paintings. He was ahead of his time. But he doesn't write about it, he shows it. 59 cents. This is what stands between me and Christ. Dove. But each of these images have two sides, because the meal cleanses us from our sins, as does the Eucharist, and there's no better cleansing product than Dove. And of course, but I think he's serious on this, the ambiguities. You see the ambiguities. It's like commercial and spiritual. And the point is, maybe not, but it's there. And of course, what do we end up with? The dove of the Holy Spirit hovering just above Jesus. And then we come to GE. Well, GE, Christ the light of the world. GE light bulbs. Oh, isn't that a little bit simple and simplistic? There are those who see the swirling. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this interpretation, but the swirling lines as the image of creation. GE's motto was, we bring good things to light. And there are those who see here the Father, the creation of the world. We bring, and let there be light. We bring good things to light. And so the swirling, triune Trinity, and if we take that interpretation, we have in that one God, the Father, Creator, we have the Holy Spirit, and we have Jesus. See, this is the kind of playfulness that he does, challenging us no less than Renaissance art or the images in Leonardo's original Last Supper. I see a more nefarious image on the right with GE. I didn't see the creation. GE, light bulbs and air conditioners. And at that time, GE was one of the leading participants, and probably still is, in the military-industrial complex, not only missiles, but weapons of mass destruction. And I think that's why that's there. And so this is what mediates between Christ and us. This commercial culture, this culture of destruction that will eventually destroy, at least it's a possibility. And so I would suggest that when we have the time to look at this art, it's of an enormous complexity that comes out of a deeply lived religious experience. Now, one or two things have to be said, and because it's raised. Oh, well, he ran out of iconic images, so he turned himself to the Christ image. I think if you look at the life, no, it's more than that, all right? I have statistics here. I could just give you the number, and I'm going to read them. No, it's not just that he ran out of images. I hope I have the number for you. I think I do. In the last 2 years of his life, 70 paintings of Christ, 448 more images in the various series, for a total of 518 images of Jesus Christ in the last 2 years of his life. I would not say that's the work of somebody who was just looking for a new source of image. And then finally, for those who'd like to dismiss him, hypocrite. There's the Andy Warhol of the studio. There's the Andy Warhol of Studio 54. And then there's this Andy Warhol. Well, hypocrisy is, first of all, a dangerous thing to charge, and second of all, he had nothing to gain from it. Hypocrisy only serves if you're going to get something from it. He hid his religious life from most people. The whole point was they didn't know about it. Only one or two friends, and they didn't take it very seriously. And if he had revealed his religious dimension, they would have thought he was nuts. They wouldn't have stopped courting him, but they would have thought so there was nothing to be gained. But rather, Andy Warhol stands as a prime example of the human condition, of a man of faith struggling to bring the different dimensions of his life together, which he had not done. The different components of his life had not been integrated, and his clear faith and struggle with the faith had yet not been brought into union with some of the other levels, like many human beings. Remember this, he died quite young, at 58, even those days young, and we don't know where that journey would have gone. I just show you some of the other images. Christ 112 times in 1986. The yellow Christ. Some of these works are 35 feet tall, long, 35 feet long, enormous. I would recommend to you Jane Daggett Dillenberger's The Religious Art of Andy Warhol, the only serious book that's been written in 1998. And this is a whole other issue of the neglect of this. 1998. She's the one who saw the photo and said, I'm going to find this art. Jane Daggett Dillenberger. I strongly recommend her work. It's still republished in Religious Art of Andy Warhol. And there has been very little continuing books 1998. Nothing of any consequence published since. Well, this brings us to Monsignor Luigi Giussani, for whom this is the religious sense. This is indeed the heart of that he saw as lurking in every work of art. This longing for something more, but so obvious in the work of Warhol and others whom at first we might dismiss as worldly and antithetical to the divine. An innate restlessness for totality and for the infinite. I just want to point out, and I'm going to do this in 2 minutes, that there are many other artists of the late 20th century for whom the religious sense explodes. Mark Rothko, with his paintings, paintings he saw as a search for the divine. George Tucker, people may not know George Tucker, but they know his paintings of frightening alienation in the subway, in modern society. He was steeped in the loneliness and isolation of people living together in urban life. I love this one because it's the Brooklyn Municipal Building. He went there to get a work permit for his building. And look at the staring eyes and the loneliness of the people behind the counters. That he experienced this. But then George Tucker, sort of a lapsed Catholic, rediscovered his faith and created some of the most, in the 1950s and 60s, beautiful triptychs and polyptychs you could imagine, about which next to nothing is written. Suddenly exploded the religious sense. Or Keith Haring. Keith Haring, the graffiti artist who died of AIDS and because of his early death has certainly become an immoral and immortal. But no one writes about the religious dimension of his art. It is ignored totally. I mean, the image of the serpent and the cross, the image of the baby radiating light, and most importantly, his project for the Franciscan friars in the city of Pisa, where he worked to create this mural and then shared meals with them and defined it as one of the most important communal experiences of his life. You will find nothing, and yet it is the religious sense. How ironic that as our culture became less and less attuned to the divine, in art, the religious sense increases and increases in the later 20th century, and Warhol is just one example. So there's Andy 1 month before he died in Milan in January of 1987 with the Dominicans, with his exhibition of, in that particular exhibit, 12 gigantic paintings of the Last Supper across the street from the original. He would go into a New York hospital a month later and die from a gallbladder operation. Andy Warhol is just one example of what Father Giussani spoke of, the religious sense of those people, artists and others, who know that in the end, only something infinite will suffice. Thank you.